Hey guys, haven't done a video on this channel for a while, but I've been watching some wrestling lately, and I'm a big fan of the kayfabe era. Anything, obviously, usually the stuff that's available to watch is, stuff from the 70s through the, I guess the kayfabe era. I would consider that 1948, the formation of the NWA, all the way through probably just the early 90s, I guess. So I'm a big fan of really 70s and 80s. Obviously 60s, if you can get a hold of it somehow. There's some footage available, but I like to go back in time and try to figure out how the different territories could have staved off the McMahon expansion, how they could have held their own, and how they could have prospered. Because you know what? There were territories that survived into the early 90s, and I think even to the late 90s when you talk about Memphis. You have Portland that survived into the early 90s. I don't know when Continental, didn't Continental last into the early 90s as well? I got to double check that. So I've been thinking a lot about world-class championship wrestling and their situation, because their situation is really interesting. I have a lot of the old Meltzer newsletters from like very early '83. I have a lot of the newsletters that go up until like 87, late 86, early 87. And as far back as 1984, even like early 1984, like spring 1984, there were rumors that Fritz was going to leave the NWA and join up with Vince. And it would have been interesting to see how that looked. Remember Vince, I think the Von Erich boys, the brothers, were on the cover of one of the WWF magazines. They were on the cover. And they were on the cover of the WWF magazine, and even featured on All American Wrestling on USA Network. This is like, I think, was it 83 or 84? And then if you watch WWF TV around the spring of '84, after David Von Erich died, the WWF did a 10-bell salute to him. Okay? And this, remember, this was later on. Vince would never mention anything about other territories or other wrestlers from other territories. So you could tell that Vince had his eyes on the Von Erichs, right? And of course, apparently he tried to purchase different promotions at this time, like Stampede. Rumors that he even tried to purchase the AWA, because obviously Vince wanted to take over the wrestling world and go national. So obviously, the Von Erichs would be a great feather in his cap. So in early 1984, after the death of David Von Erich, you have the plans for the Parade of Champions 1984. And the Parade of Champions is one of the early supercards that would be given like a name, and they were annual supercards, because supercards are nothing new to wrestling. If you look at the history of the different promotions, they would have stadium shows, and usually they would have them every few years. They wouldn't have them once a year. I think like Watts with the Superdome shows was the first one to hold like stadium shows, annually or even multiple times a year. But something new was happening in the 80s, like with Starrcade '83. There was this concept of the supercard, the annual supercard, which would be kind of like the yearly Super Bowl for that particular promotion. So Parade of Champions became that for the World Class Championship Wrestling territory. And the plan was for Kerry Von Erich to go over Flair for the NWA World Title at that time, and he did. And apparently, it drew about 34,000 fans. And there were people that said that it wasn't even really promoted heavily. They could have drew 40,000. Okay? Which I think if they had drawn 40,000, that may have been a record for American Pro Wrestling. But either way, 34,000 is a great crowd. And so Flair, Von Erich wins the NWA World Title. He keeps it for about 3 weeks. So from what I gather, there was some controversy with that politically. Apparently Fritz didn't like the fact that the title change from Von Erich over Flair wasn't really like heavily promoted in the other NWA territories. And he probably didn't like the fact that Kerry only got 3 weeks with the title, and probably understood, because you got to understand what was going on in the NWA politically at this time. The NWA of the early 80s was not the NWA of the 70s. What I mean by that is the power shift had went from the Midwest, Florida, because if you look at the NWA, the all the way from like the 60s and all the way through most of the 70s, the power center of the NWA was St. Louis. Florida was like probably the most prominent territory in the NWA, the Florida promotion. And then St. Louis was like the headquarters. That's where Sam Muchnick, the president, he booked the NWA champion out of St. Louis. They would have the cards in St. Louis. It wasn't a regular territory. It was a one city town, one city territory. And so St. Louis was a prominent place where wrestlers really wanted to wrestle. And so St. Louis would have cards every 3 weeks. And Sam Muchnick wielded a lot of influence in the NWA. He was the president. He's the one that kept the NWA out of the trouble with the federal government and the monopoly accusations. And the NWA at that time in the 60s and 70s and even 50s was pretty well balanced in terms of the power balance was pretty even. You had, NWA had, flourishing territories in Detroit, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Of course, you had, Kansas City, St. Louis, Texas with Paul Bosch, Fritz Von Erich running Dallas, Bosch, Houston, Amarillo, the Funks. Of course, you had Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas with Jim Crockett, Georgia with Barnett, Southeastern Championship Wrestling in Gulf Coast, Tennessee and Alabama, Pensacola, Florida. So it was pretty well balanced. Of course, they had the Canadian territories. By the early 80s, though, the power of balance in the NWA had shifted to the Southeast, to specifically Georgia and the Carolinas. Muchnick, I believe, his presidency of the NWA ended about 77 or 78, I forget. And then Fritz sat in as president. And then it was Jim Crockett. Now, in the late 70s, and it's important to know this to understand the politics of the early mid-80s in the NWA. In the late 70s, many of the NWA territories started weakening greatly. Detroit, San Francisco, and LA are three territories that really weakened greatly by the late 70s. I mean, they were on their last legs by the end of the 70s, and even they pretty much all died out in the very early 80s. So that left a gaping hole in much of the country for any promoter to go in there and run, which used to be pretty much an NWA strongholds. Fritz, oh yeah, not to mention that even Florida, by the late 70s, by the end of the 70s, wasn't what it was prior to the early mid 70s. They were a powerhouse. They were still strong by the end of the 70s, but it wasn't it wasn't, the shift of power had switched to the Mid-Atlantic and Georgia promotions. Georgia just hooked up the satellite. They were going national. Their show was going national. And the Carolinas was on fire, the Mid-Atlantic territory. So by 1984, and remember, Crockett just had a very successful 1983. Georgia's again hooked up to the satellite. They're touring Michigan and you know, Tennessee. They're touring Ohio. They're touring a lot of the areas where the Sheik's promotion used to tour. So again, Muchnick had retired at the beginning of 1982. St. Louis wasn't what it was. It was no longer the center of the NWA. In fact, they had just, by the time of early 1984, St. Louis pretty much just got taken over by the WWF. That was one of the first promotions that Vince attacked. Because Bob Geigel pretty much mishandled St. Louis in 1983 after taking over from Sam Muchnick. And so St. Louis was no longer the power center of the NWA. In fact, they're taken over by Vince, and they try to recover with Geigel, Fritz, and Verne, but they were on the losing end of that stick. So by 1984, Jim Crockett wields a lot of power. And his man was Ric Flair. His man was Ric Flair. So Fritz correctly understood that his son's 3-week title reign may well have been his last. And you got to remember, Kerry Von Erich at this time, he's a young guy. I think he was like 23 years old at this time when he won the NWA World Title. A young guy. And Kerry Von Erich was the prototypical 80s wrestler, like 80s babyface wrestler, great body, charisma, a natural charisma that dripped off of him. I mean, he didn't have great interviews, but he had that kind of like dumb jock charisma. And so Fritz knew that he likely has seen the last of his sons being NWA champion. So there were rumors early on of him switching allegiances to the WWF. Now, we know it never happened. And we know that Vince, when he went into Dallas, even his WrestleMania closed circuit event in 1985 failed. Vince didn't do good in Dallas because the fans there were hot for world-class championship wrestling. They were hot for it. World-class championship wrestling was on fire. But Fritz, of course, is still part of the NWA, and Flair would go and make tours in world class from all the way 1984, 85. He even main evented against Kevin Von Erich at Parade of Champions 85, which I think drew 26,000. The 84 one, now that I remember, drew about 32,000 plus. Now Fritz, there was the NWA convention coming up in 85. You got to remember now, by early 1985, Jim Crockett had gained even more power because he bought from Vince McMahon Jr. the WTBS time slot for $1 million to take over WTBS. Because remember, McMahon had taken over that slot from Georgia, and Georgia had recovered and started their own TV show on WTBS, but they were on a bad slot. Nonetheless, when Crockett took over WTBS, he also bought out the Georgia promotion, or what was left of it. So now Jim Crockett has national cable TV, and he's expanding across the country. But there's this problem of the other NWA territories for Crockett. Because you could tell that Crockett's goal was to basically counter WWF and be a national promotion. Now, apparently, Crockett, after he takes over WTBS, starts flexing his muscle with the other NWA promoters. That if those NWA promoters want a tour of the NWA champion, because you got to remember the NWA World Champion, unlike WWF and AWA, was a touring world champion. They didn't really. The NWA World Champion was not supposed to have a homestead. He was a touring champion, and Flair was still a touring champion in 1985. But as NWA territories were a little less in 1985 than they were a few years, Crockett was able to monopolize Flair a little bit. But he was still, for the most part, a touring champion. And Crockett needed to have Flair in his territory more because he's going national and he needs the draw. So Crockett was working out a deal with the promoters that if they wanted Flair to tour, they had to accept a package deal of a couple other matches on the card. That they just weren't going to get Flair, they were going to get a couple other matches. And what this would do is this would hurt the local territory. Why? Because the fans were seeing, the fans were not only getting Flair, which was fine, because the job of the NWA World Champion was to enhance the local territory and the local territory's top wrestlers. But now the fans were getting one or two other matches from Crockett, and it was getting the fans used to Crockett wrestlers, and they would draw good when these shows would happen where you'd get additional Crockett wrestlers on the show. It would draw good because these were national guys. But then when the local territory, after these guys left, the fans got a taste of the Crockett wrestlers, and then at the next local card, they would be less inclined to buy tickets because they just got a taste of the Crockett wrestlers, and they're probably have that appetite for more now. And so instead of the NWA World Champion coming to enhance the local territory, Crockett's adding more wrestlers from his promotion to make the local territory look minor league compared to his wrestlers, thereby the fans clamoring for the Crockett wrestlers and not wanting to buy tickets just to see their local talent. Now, likely Fritz saw this, and apparently the 1985 NWA convention, Crockett laid out his terms for these local territories, and either you abided by them or you didn't. Because by this time, the balance of power was lopsided. It was in Crockett's favor. Whereas in the 70s, 60s, 50s, late 40s, when NWA started, the balance of power of the NWA was very even across the country. You got Midwest, West Coast, Southeast, Canada, Mexico, Japan. And by this point in time, the NWA promoters that were still there, and there were still a good amount of them. You had, Continental, you had Pacific Northwest, you had Fritz, which was probably the biggest of the remaining NWA promoters. You had Florida, okay? Memphis was technically part of the AWA, I believe, but they still worked with the NWA. Watts wasn't part of the NWA, but he still worked with them. But you had Kansas City Geico. So, I mean, the power of the NWA is now heavily in Crockett's with one promoter. And it wasn't like that before. Well, Fritz decided not to play ball with Jim Crockett's terms. And so there was a scheduled tour of Flair in October to go into the world-class territory to defend his title, and apparently that was canceled. And this is when you start to see Flair divorce himself from the NWA. Now, by this point in time, Vince doesn't need Fritz anymore. So the options for Fritz to join up with Vince have pretty much left, because Vince is in a better position, in a better negotiating position than he was in 1984, even though in 1984 he's on the rise. But by 1985, the fall of 85, Vince has established the WWF as the name brand of pro wrestling through MTV, through WrestleMania, through Saturday Night's Main Event. The crossover appeal has happened. So Vince doesn't need to negotiate with Fritz. So that's kind of out of the building now. And now Vince is in the position in fall of 1985 where he's not acknowledging other promotions like he was like in the beginning phases of his expansion. He doesn't need to now. So, that being said, Fritz is kind of on an island. Either he could accept the terms of Crockett to get Flair to tour, but Fritz knows what Crockett is up to. He wants to send his Crockett wrestlers in there, and yeah, it will pop the territory initially, but once those wrestlers leave, those fans would have gotten a taste of the Crockett wrestlers, and then when those wrestlers leave, it's going to make the local talent look not as major league. Because remember, the Crockett wrestlers are on national TV. And basically what Crockett wants to do is get the local territories to rely on him more. Now again, 1985, Kerry Von Erich is at his peak. He's a great draw. He is at his peak. I mean, for example, Super Clash 85, the AWA Supercard at Kaminsky Park, apparently a lot of the fans were there for Kerry. And that drew like 21,000 fans. And they drew like, I think there was like, what, 30,000 fans at the Cotton Bowl for the haircut match, the Von Erich brothers against Adams and Hernandez. Now, the late fall of 85 and early winter of 85, you notice a dip in the attendance in World Class. Just look at the Star Wars cards of November, Thanksgiving, and December. Compare them to previous years. There is a dip in the attendance significantly. And I think what you're seeing is the end of the run of World Class being on fire. Remember, it caught on fire with the December 1982 cage match where Terry Gordy tried to interfere on behalf of Kerry. Kerry rejected it, and then Terry Gordy hit Kerry with the cage. Ric Flair wins, and it starts this incredible feud with the Von Erich brothers and the Freebirds. And I mean, World Class is just on fire from that point all the way through, I mean, the fall of 1985. But now you're seeing a dip in attendance. And I think it's because just things don't last forever, no matter how good they are. And I think what you're seeing is that leveling off period. And it couldn't happen at a worse time for Fritz because he's about to part ways with the NWA. I mean, if he ever needed the help of Crockett, it'd be now, but then he knew he would set himself up for long-term failure. So a series of unfortunate events start to happen. Gino Hernandez, one of his top heels, gets killed in January of 1986. And that's a big blow. That is a big blow because he was a top heel for the territory. And he was about to embark on a feud with Chris Adams that would have definitely drew money. The Freebirds return. And amazingly, They try to reignite the Freebirds Von Erich feud, and amazingly, it doesn't count. That magic is gone. It doesn't move the needle. Surprisingly, and I think the world class powers that be were shocked, because I think, okay, this is going to remedy it. We're going to, I mean, come on, it's the Freebirds Von Erichs, and they come back, and it doesn't move the needle. So, February of 1986, Fritz officially pulls out of the NWA, which had been rumored to happen for almost 2 years by that point. And they declare the American champion as the world heavyweight champion, Rick Rude. So this means there's no Ric Flair for Parade of Champions 86. I mean, from what I understand, they drew about 24,000, so that's pretty good still. Pretty good card. But it's the beginning of the end for World Class. Kerry has a motorcycle accident in June of '86, just when they needed Kerry the most to carry the flag of what they were trying to accomplish, which was a promotion that had a world champion. And Kerry gets in a car accident, a motorcycle accident. We all know what happened. Lost his foot over it. I mean, he came back, and it's impressive what he did, because he came back pretty strong. And then, of course, Bill Watts took over some of his wrestlers around this time. The Freebirds leave, Missing Link, Tatum and Victory, the Booker, Ken Mantell, I think Sunshine. So some of the a good chunk of the world class wrestlers leave and go to Watts. That's another big thing that happens around this time. And then, of course, Watts, working with Crockett, tries to run shows in Dallas, the Reunion Arena. So all this stuff is happening at once. And almost overnight, World Class goes from being this territory on fire all the way through fall of '85 to now they don't have Kerry. Gino is dead. Their booker goes to Watts, their main rival at this time. Watts with Crockett now starts running shows in Dallas. And it couldn't have been a worse time. And World Class was never the same after this. By the time Kerry returns in November of 1987, World Class is a shell of its former self. I mean, Star Wars 1987, December, a card that would draw like 19,000, 17,000, a Reunion Arena draws 2,000. They had run, Parade of Champions in '87 and '88 again. And I think they drew in '87, 5,000, and '88, 7,000. And then in 1989, they didn't have one because, unbeknownst to me, watching at this time, because I was watching World Class, and I'm waiting for them to announce the card for the Parade of Champions '89, and they never do. I was shocked. They're not going to have a Parade of Champions. Well, by this time, unbeknownst to me, Jerry Jarrett had bought the promotion in November of '88. Even though the World Class name remained until summer of '89, in effect, World Class as we knew it died in November of 1988. The end of an era. And I think in my next video, I'll do kind of a part 2 to this, what Fritz could have done to keep World Class strong during this time. But yeah, it's a sad story to see something that was so hot and just so popular, like, take a strong tumble almost overnight. All right, guys, have a good one. Bye.